Well, hey, it's Pastor Tim. During this month of February on Tim Talk, we're addressing the important subject of marriage. So if you did miss last week's episode, we included it in the description below. Last week we talked about 2 marriage landmines that you want to avoid. So if you missed that, please check that out in the comments below. Today we're addressing a difficulty that sometimes arises in marriage, and that's when one person feels like they're pulling all the weight in marriage. In other words, marriage feels like a one-sided relationship. So how do we deal with that struggle when it arises in our marriage? Well, first of all, let me address this by telling you 2 things that you should avoid, or 2 approaches to avoid. First of all, avoid the approach of just stuffing it down. Sometimes we want to avoid confrontation, we want to avoid problems, and one way we avoid that problems is just by kind of ignoring it and stuffing it under the rug. Well, the reason that that's bad is because it really can cause you to become immersed in the negative self-talk, and you can become bitter, and all that leads to really is a toxic soul and a toxic marriage as well. It's really not helping your marriage. Conversely, the other approach that can be just as destructive is simply just spewing out your frustration and anger on your spouse. While that might make you feel better, it won't help your marriage be better. So instead of stuffing it down, or instead of spewing out your frustration on your spouse, the Bible commends a different approach, a much more healthy approach that will help build your marriage. And that is simply to speak the truth in love. Ephesians 4:25 encourages us to lay aside those falsehoods or lying and instead speak the truth to your neighbor. Now you might think, how does that verse apply to marriage? We're not talking about my neighbor. Well, biblically speaking, your closest neighbor is your spouse. It's not the house next door. It's the spouse, the family that you live with. And so if you feel like your relationship is a one-sided relationship, the first thing you should do is to lovingly and respectfully convey how you're feeling to your spouse. And it might sound something like this. You know, honey, I've really been struggling lately. I feel like our relationship is a bit one-sided right now. I really want to understand what's going on so that we can have a healthy marriage. Now, there's 3 important aspects about that statement that are very positive. Number 1, it's communicated with respect for the other person. Number 2, you're really seeking to understand. You're not coming out accusing your spouse of wrong, but you're really trying to understand what's going on right now in your marriage. And thirdly, that statement shows how much you value the marriage. So a statement like that can go a long way to trying to overcome this struggle of a one-sided relationship. Now, this Sunday at FCC, I'm going to be expounding on this even more as we talk about the importance of proper communication in marriage. And so you can show up on Sunday at Easton Area Middle School Auditorium at 10:30, or you can join us in person as you watch live on Facebook. So again, the first approach to dealing with a one-sided relationship in marriage is to speak the truth in love, to speak respectfully to your spouse about how you're feeling about your marriage right now. The second one is this: don't bail on your marriage. Every marriage hits some rough patch at one time or another. So instead of bailing out, embrace this as an opportunity to see God grow your love for Him and for your spouse. Remember, marriage isn't about you. Marriage is about reflecting God's love for us in Jesus Christ. And so let the pattern of God's love be instructive for you as you feel like you're pulling all the weight in your marriage. You know, if we think about God's love gave without expecting anything in return. 1 John 4:10 says this, "Love consists in this, not that we loved God, but that God loved us and sent his Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins." And then in the very next verse, he gives the application of that. Dear friends, if God loved us in this way, we also must love one another. Notice how God's love is the pattern for our love in all of our relationships. And how did God show his love? He showed his love in action. He didn't offer us the best in his Son, Jesus, because we were so deserving. Actually, we were so undeserving, yet God gave of himself. He gave us Jesus Christ. So model God's love in your marriage, even in those difficult moments. And so here's what you need to remember as you try to love your spouse in those difficult moments. Even though those feelings of love might be dormant, they can come to life as you choose to love your spouse in action. Now, you might be wondering, well, how can my marriage really change if my spouse doesn't change? How can my marriage really change if I'm doing all the changing? Well, I like how one author compared marriage to a dance. You think of people dancing and dancing well. There's two partners and they're dancing in tandem to the music. Now, chances are you're watching this video because you feel like you're doing all the dancing in your marriage and your spouse either isn't dancing or they're not dancing very well. Well, let me encourage you with this. Even if your spouse doesn't become a better dancer, your dance can improve simply by you choosing to become a better dancer. And what can happen as you choose as a spouse to grow in your love for God is that your spouse might simply take notice and say, you know what? I can do this too. Maybe your spouse might notice there's something different about you. And that would be great for you and your marriage. And so my heart for you today is, if you're watching this, is that your dance, your marriage would improve and that your marriage would truly become a union of souls. You know, one of the things that can really help our marriages become a union of souls is by communicating well with one another. And so next week on Tim Talk, we're going to talk about how we can communicate well with our spouse even in the midst of conflict. So join us next Thursday for our next segment of Tim Talk.